At 12:30 in the morning on August 9th, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was fast asleep in his bedroom next to his wife. They were at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when the sharp ring of his cell phone cut through the silence and woke him up. Kyle groggily reached for the phone, his eyes adjusting to the bright screen. He looked at the caller ID and saw it was his 26-year-old younger brother Brandon. Kyle answered it, and before he could even get a word out, Brandon's panicked voice came through the speaker. He said he needed help, and then he immediately launched into a story that sounded completely unbelievable. Brandon told Kyle he was driving north on Highway 277. Now, this is a really desolate, two-lane country road that cuts through the vast, empty landscape of West Texas. There's not much out there. Brandon said that as he was driving, three men started chasing him. He was trying to get away, but his truck was just about to run out of gas. He was desperate. He wanted Kyle to drop everything right then in the middle of the night and come meet him. The plan was for Kyle to secretly hand off a can of gasoline so Brandon could fill up his truck and finally escape these three men who were after him. As Kyle listened to all of this, he wasn't really feeling scared for his brother. At least, not in the way Brandon wanted him to be. He wasn't worried about three mysterious men. Instead, Kyle's main feeling was just immense annoyance. After hearing this frantic, bizarre story, Kyle was almost certain that there were no three men. He figured his brother Brandon was just high again and was having a powerful hallucination. He was in the middle of a substance-induced episode. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. He had managed to stay clean for about 6 months, and he'd been working really hard on himself. He was trying to be a better partner to his fiancée, Ledessa, and a better father to his 4 young children, but just 2 days before this late-night call, Brandon had called Kyle for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. Instead, he tried to talk his brother down. He told Brandon, "Don't do it, you're clean, you're doing so well, don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that Brandon hadn't listened to his advice. And ever since that phone call, Brandon's behavior had been getting more and more erratic. Kyle was pretty sure that even though he hadn't helped him, Brandon must have found drugs somewhere else. In fact, the whole reason Brandon was even out on Highway 277 at this ungodly hour was because he'd gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. Kyle knew this from talking to his parents earlier in the evening. Brandon was supposed to be on his way to their parents' house to cool off for a while. He was essentially in a timeout for his bad behavior. So, his presence on that specific road at that specific time already fit into a pattern of recent trouble. Knowing that his brother was very likely high, Kyle understood that trying to reason with him would be pointless. Telling him, "Brandon, those three men aren't real, you're just hallucinating, please go to our parents' house," would have been like talking to a brick wall. Brandon wouldn't have listened. So, Kyle decided to try a different approach. He just focused on trying to calm his brother down over the phone. He wasn't thinking Brandon was in any real physical danger from other people. The only danger was from Brandon himself. But as Kyle tried to soothe him, Brandon didn't calm down at all. He just got more and more worked up, his voice growing more anxious as he kept talking about these three men who he said were gaining on him. Finally, Kyle just couldn't take it anymore and asked him straight up, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" As Kyle expected, Brandon completely denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high. He just kept begging Kyle, pleading with him to please come help him, to hurry up before these men caught him. "Come give me the gas I need so I can escape. Please, man, you have to hurry." At this point, Kyle felt like there was no use in even talking to Brandon anymore. A part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. This was all just so crazy. He had his own life, his own family, his own responsibilities. He shouldn't have to be babysitting his younger brother who was making these terrible choices. But at the same time, despite everything, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even though he was frustrated and resented being put in this position, he loved Brandon very much. And even though he truly believed there was no imminent danger from these phantom men, he decided he had to do something. He thought, you know what, I'm just going to go out there. I'll drive out to Highway 277, I'll find Brandon, and I'll just get him home safely. So, he told Brandon he would be right there, and then he hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving north on that same dark stretch of Highway 277. His wife was in the passenger seat next to him, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. Kyle's wife hadn't wanted him going out alone in the middle of the night to deal with his brother in such a volatile state. She had insisted that she and their son come along for support, so as Kyle drove down the empty road, he scanned the darkness on either side, looking for any sign of Brandon's truck. To really paint a picture for you, this highway is the definition of desolate. There was no other traffic out there. In every direction, it was just wide open plains, dotted with some low shrubs and a few small, scraggly trees. It's a vast, empty area. Even at night, your headlights can cut through the darkness and you can see for a very long way ahead of you. Kyle had a great view of the road, but he couldn't see any other vehicles. There was no truck, no cars, nothing at all. His brother was nowhere in sight, but Kyle just kept driving. his eyes peering into the darkness, scanning the fields just in case Brandon had maybe veered off the road somewhere. Given the state he was in, that seemed entirely possible. But after driving for a while longer, he finally saw it. Way up ahead, parked crookedly, half on the shoulder and half on the road itself, was a pickup truck. Its lights were off. It was just sitting there, silent. The engine wasn't even idling. It was completely turned off. As Kyle got closer, he recognized it. It was Brandon's truck. So he had found him. Or at least he'd found his truck. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her and his son to stay in the car while he went over to talk to Brandon. At this point, Kyle was fully expecting to find his brother sitting inside the truck, probably still high and waiting for him to show up. He also couldn't help but notice that there was nobody else around. No other cars, no sign of the three men that were supposedly chasing his brother. It just reinforced his belief that Brandon was sitting there, high as a kite, and that he was about to have a very difficult conversation to get him to go home. But when Kyle walked across the empty highway and got to the truck, he peered through the driver's side window. And there was nobody inside. The truck was completely empty. Brandon was gone. Kyle stood there for a moment, totally confused. This just didn't make any sense. On the entire drive out to the truck, while they were on Highway 277, Brandon had been calling Kyle's phone repeatedly, over and over and over again. He kept saying things like, "Come on, you've got to hurry up. You have to get here. They're gaining on me. I'm in real trouble. Bring that gasoline. You've got to get here now." And now, Kyle was finally here. He had reached Brandon's truck. It was right there in front of him. But Brandon himself had vanished. He hadn't said anything on the phone about leaving his truck. So where was he? What was going on? Kyle started looking around, getting more and more confused. He looked under the vehicle. He opened the doors and searched the inside of the truck for his brother, which felt completely absurd. Why would his brother be hiding in his own truck? But as he was searching the truck and scanning the dark fields around him, Kyle's phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, who was now feeling incredibly annoyed and exasperated, answered the phone. He said, "Brandon, where are you?" And Brandon's voice came back, calm as ever. "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle shot back, "No, you're not. I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here, but you're not." But just then, Kyle looked up and saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards him. As the car got closer, he realized it was a police car. So he's standing there on the phone with his missing brother, watching a cop car approach and clearly slow down, as if the officer was planning to stop and talk to him. And as this was happening, with the cop car pulling up right in front of him, Brandon said something on the phone that made Kyle's blood run cold. He said, "Run away from that cop." Now, think about that for a second. That statement meant that Brandon had to be somewhere nearby. He could obviously see the cop car approaching Kyle. He was watching the whole scene unfold, even though Kyle couldn't see him at all. Kyle quickly tried to process this. He was thinking, where could Brandon possibly be? He looked out again at the landscape. It was just open fields on both sides of the highway. A barren, flat wasteland in the middle of Texas. There was nowhere to hide. There were a couple of bigger shrubs and a few small trees way off in the distance, but really there was no cover. So, where was Brandon? At this point, Kyle was just furious. He was confused, but mostly just angry. "What are you doing? Brandon?" He knew the reason his brother wanted him to run. It was because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest related to a previous drug charge. So Brandon was just trying to protect himself, telling Kyle not to get involved with the police, to keep him out of it. And Kyle was standing there, having driven all the way out into the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night to deal with this mess for his brother, who was clearly out of his mind. He was so annoyed. But again, what could he even do? He had absolutely no idea where Brandon was. Kyle was about to say something back to Brandon, to demand that he tell him where he was and to come out, but just then Brandon hung up. By this point, the police officer had arrived. He parked his patrol car, got out, and walked over to Kyle, who was now just standing awkwardly next to his brother's abandoned truck. He had put his phone back in his pocket. When the officer got close, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call that had come in from a trucker who reported seeing a stranded driver on the side of the road. So he asked Kyle if that was him. He pointed to Brandon's truck and asked, "Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver?" But Kyle said no, it wasn't his truck, it belonged to his brother. And despite how much he just wanted to tell the deputy the whole messy truth, he felt he had to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that his brother had left his car here because he was probably high on meth and was hiding somewhere in the nearby fields, and oh, by the way, he also has a warrant out for his arrest. Instead, Kyle made up a story on the spot. He said, "Well, I think he went off to get some gas. He called me and said he'd run out, so he parked his car here. He probably just started walking down the road. I just got here myself." Then he asked the deputy, "Is it okay with you if I get back in my car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? I'm sure he's fine, but he did call me for help with gas. So, do you mind if I go look for him?" And surprisingly, the deputy seemed to buy it. He just said, "Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead." So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started the engine. He pulled away and drove farther down the highway away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror to see what the cop was doing. The deputy was just standing there, still parked next to Brandon's truck. Eventually, when Kyle had driven far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road again. He then began angrily calling his brother's phone over and over and over, trying to get him to pick up. But Brandon never answered any of the calls, so at this point, Kyle had no idea what was going on with his brother. He was completely out of contact. Kyle and his family sat there on the side of the dark highway for a little while longer, continuing to try and get in touch with Brandon, but it was no use. Eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son started crying and complaining. It was so late, and he was tired. Kyle's wife was exhausted too. It was now too late in the morning, and Kyle was just completely over the whole situation. He thought to himself, "You know what? Brandon is a grown man. I tried to come out here and help him get out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to talk to me and he wants to hide out on the side of a highway, then that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home." And so that's exactly what he did. He turned the car around and drove right back the way he came. On his way, he passed by his brother's truck again, which was still there on the side of the road. This meant Brandon was clearly still hiding somewhere nearby, and standing next to the truck was still Deputy Neil, presumably waiting for Brandon to show back up. Kyle just drove right past them without stopping, went back to his home in San Angelo, and he and his family went to bed. He figured that tomorrow he would probably hear from Brandon, who would have some crazy story to explain what had really happened. But whatever it was, Kyle decided that was Brandon's problem to deal with. Not long after Kyle had driven past him on his way home, Deputy Neil decided he couldn't just sit there all night waiting for Brandon to return. He had already done a quick search of Brandon's truck and found nothing particularly concerning inside. There was no phone, no wallet, and no keys. These were all things that someone would typically take with them if they had run out of gas and decided to walk to find help. So, the story Kyle had told him seemed to check out. It really did look like Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and started walking. Then his brother showed up, and now the whole situation was playing out. So, Deputy Neil figured he had other, more pressing calls to get to. It didn't seem like this was a major emergency. He reached inside Brandon's truck, turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them securely. After that, he got back in his own patrol car and he took off to attend to his other duties for the night. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Deputy Neil drove back out to Highway 277. He just wanted to check and make sure that Brandon had eventually come back and picked up his truck. But when he arrived, the truck was still sitting there right where he had left it, its hazard lights still blinking. At this point, Deputy Neil started to get a bit concerned about Brandon. You know, if he was out on foot walking to get gas, even though the initial risk seemed low, it was possible that something could have happened to him. That might explain why he hadn't come back for his truck yet. Maybe he was hit by a car, or maybe he got lost in the dark. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or maybe Brandon had just decided not to get his truck yet. Maybe he had gotten a ride home and was planning to come back for it later. Regardless, it just seemed like Deputy Neil really needed to follow up with Brandon in person just to make sure that he was okay. So, Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could look up Brandon's contact information. But when he walked in the door, he didn't even have a chance to start digging. Another employee immediately told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had told them a very different story from the one that Brandon's brother Kyle had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past couple of days. And last night, the night that his truck was found, Brandon was supposed to have been on his way to his parents' house to cool off after their argument. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back home to Ledessa's house either. Brandon was now totally unaccounted for, and on top of that, nobody could get in touch with him. Everyone had been calling and texting his phone, but there was no response. After hearing this new information, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry. It was clear that Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa was now telling this completely different and much more worrying story. So the very first thing Neil did was go and speak to Kyle again and also to the rest of Brandon's family to try and get the story straight. And it very quickly became clear to Deputy Neil that any omissions or even lies about what had happened on the night Brandon went missing were not because the family was trying to hide something sinister. Yes, they were trying to protect Brandon, but it was mostly because they didn't understand just how serious the situation really was. Now that it was clear Brandon was truly missing and nobody knew what had happened to him, the family was very open and honest. They told the police they really didn't know where he was and that yes, it was possible he was on drugs, they just didn't know for sure. But the bottom line was, he was missing, and they needed the police to go and look for him, and so that's exactly what Deputy Neil did. Over the next 4 days, a huge search operation was launched. Neil led the effort, which was centered all around the spot on Highway 277 where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canine units, helicopters, and large ground search teams, some of which were equipped with thermal cameras that could detect body heat, they found nothing. Despite covering a vast area all around where Brandon had clearly been, there was absolutely no sign of him. They also spoke to all the homeowners and property owners in the general area to see if maybe they had seen something strange that night, maybe they had seen Brandon, or maybe even those 3 men that he claimed had been chasing him. But nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. So basically, Brandon was definitely not in that area, and there was no evidence that he had been there other than his abandoned truck. That was the only thing they had. And so, Deputy Neil and the other authorities involved in the search eventually came to a conclusion. Based on the fact that Brandon had been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he hadn't been seen in days with no trace of him anywhere, they believed that Brandon had simply fled. He wasn't there because he had chosen not to be there. He was never in any real danger, he had just run away from his problems, and searching for him in that area was a waste of time. They basically just had to wait for Brandon to show up somewhere at some point in the future. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case of a man voluntarily disappearing. That is, until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a piece of information that changed everything. On August 13, 2013, 4 days after Brandon went missing, and right around the time the official search had been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across his desk from Ledessa. She looked extremely upset. She explained that she had gotten so worried about Brandon that she had started looking through their shared cell phone records, and she had found something that was really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper from her purse and handed it to the officer, pointing to a specific section. The officer quickly realized he was looking at a printed copy of Brandon's call logs from the night he disappeared, and what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. In between a whole flurry of calls to his brother Kyle and to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 absolutely terrified her. She explained that Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid contact with the police. He was terrified of them. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even told him to run away from the police on the night he went missing, when he saw Deputy Neil approaching. So she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But then she asked, why, after calling the police for help, did he then presumably run away from them? It just didn't make any sense at all. All of this came as a total surprise to the officer and to the entire sheriff's department. Up until that moment, their belief had been that a random trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver, and that was how Deputy Neil got involved in the first place. Nobody had any idea that there had been another separate 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch center in that area was very small, underfunded, and understaffed. It seems that at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball and failed to inform the sheriff's department about Brandon's call. They genuinely did not know about it. But now that they did, they absolutely needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department immediately contacted the 911 dispatch center, and they sent over an audio recording of Brandon's call. When the investigators listened to it, they were shocked. For one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent, life-threatening danger. This was not the low-stakes call of a stranded driver with car trouble. This was the sound of someone who believed they were in real peril. And secondly, if you listen very closely to the recording, you could hear the faint sound of somebody else's voice in the background. On Brandon's side of the call, shortly before the line went dead, the call went like this. The dispatcher says, 911 emergency. Brandon replies, yes, I'm in the middle of a field. We're just pushing guys over right here going toward Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got chased to the woods pretty hard. The confused dispatcher says, okay, now run that by me. Brandon then says something that sounds like, we're not talking to him. I accidentally ran into him. The dispatcher asks, you ran into him. Okay. Brandon says, got the first guy. The dispatcher then asks, do you need an ambulance? Brandon replies, yeah. No, I need the cops. The dispatcher asks, okay, is anybody hurt? Hello, hello, hello? And then the call cuts out. So at this point, the authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't seem like a simple disappearance anymore. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body. But the idea that there was another voice on the call and that Brandon was talking about being chased through the woods by these men, this audio recording gave a huge amount of legitimacy to the story he had told his brother. And so the search, which had just been officially ended, was quickly resumed and dramatically expanded. For the next full year, with all these additional resources being poured into the effort, there was a massive, sustained search to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that stretch of Highway 277, all over the fields near where his truck was found. There was no evidence. He had vanished, and so, ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. For the most part, the authorities just had to move on to other cases. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ledessa, would go on to hire 2 separate private detectives. Both of them would conduct their own large-scale searches multiple times all around the area where Brandon left his truck and even in other parts of the state. But they too came up completely empty, and as the years passed by with no answers, Brandon's disappearance started to capture more and more public attention. It began to be featured on TV shows and podcasts. People came up with all kinds of theories about what might have happened. Maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere into the wilderness and was attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by those 3 men and they had kidnapped or killed him. And maybe that other voice you can hear on the 911 recording belonged to one of those men. Or maybe he really had just successfully fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department had originally thought. Nobody really knew for sure. And so, for 9 long years, Brandon's case remained full of questions and had 0 answers, but then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277, to the very area where Brandon had disappeared 9 years earlier, an area which had been searched so many times over the years. And this small group of volunteers would end up making the single biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were meticulously combing through a field right off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old, weathered pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They immediately called the sheriff's department. Very quickly, a team of deputies arrived, cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that very same field, not far from where the shorts and shoes were found, they discovered a fragment of a human skull. DNA testing was performed and it confirmed that the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would finally answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance. But actually, it just made the whole thing even more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near where his truck had been parked. It was an area that had been searched so many times, with thermal cameras and trained canines and helicopters and hundreds of human searchers. And for 9 years, nobody had found it. Remember, this area off the side of the highway is not some thick, dense forest. It is a huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass, short cactus plants, and a few scattered trees. It is a very easy place to find things. Yet this skull fragment was not found. Neither were the shorts or the shoes. It just seemed so completely improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is that despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, the K9 units, the thermal cameras that were used, and the hundreds of volunteers and professional searchers that combed this specific area for years, they all just somehow missed a grown man wearing bright white sneakers lying in a barren strip of West Texas where it is incredibly easy to see anything. That's option 1. Or option 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were all looking for him. He was somewhere else entirely. But if you believe option 2, the question then becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he all that time? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? And even if you could answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes end up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still do not have a good answer. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. Remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Tab 1 on the night of March 2, 2006, a 28-year-old police corporal named Sergio Poeta was patrolling a remote dirt road in rural Argentina on his motorcycle. It was pitch black out with no streetlights whatsoever. On either side of the road were mostly vast, open fields, occasionally interspersed with thick patches of forest and dense vegetation with the massive mountains rising up silently in the background. There was absolutely nobody around him for miles. This was a remote area called the Poma, which was incredibly famous for its beautiful natural landscapes and traditional cowboy culture. Sergio was out here patrolling for poachers who came out at night to trap or kill the wild cats, monkeys, and exotic birds that often sold for a lot of money on the black market. It had been an exceptionally quiet night so far, but Sergio knew from experience that the later it got, the more likely it would be that he would catch someone doing something highly illegal. At around 10 o'clock in the evening, Sergio was riding down the road towards the crossroads that locals called El Cruz de las Cañas. Up ahead, in the deep darkness, he saw the red tail lights of a car. At first, it seemed like this car was coming to a stop, but then it turned off the road and drove into a nearby cluster of low trees and thick vegetation about the size of a football field. Then, these tail lights disappeared. Sergio felt his heart start to beat a bit faster because he knew this had to be a poacher. He thought this poacher had seen him and realized he could be a cop, and so was driving off the road and basically trying to hide. Sergio sped up on his motorcycle, and when he reached the spot where this car had left the road, he pulled over and parked. Sergio climbed off his bike and then radioed into headquarters his location and asked for backup. Then he unholstered his gun. He knew this far out it was going to take backup a long time to get here, and Sergio had no intentions of letting these poachers get away. Sergio had a flashlight, but he did not bother to take it out because he did not want to give away his position to whoever was hiding. But in the darkness, Sergio was having a really hard time finding where in this thick vegetation the car had actually gone. There were no broken branches or crushed bushes. The entire vegetation looked completely uniform and intact, and so Sergio, with his gun drawn in front of him, began pacing along the shoulder of this dirt road, looking for tire tracks on the ground. But after looking for a while, he could not find any. There was no indication that a car was ever here or drove into this vegetation, and so eventually Sergio just stopped and listened. He figured the poachers could only have driven a little ways into the trees before stopping, and so he hoped to hear them moving around. But as he stood there, all he could hear was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crickets and cicadas chirping and buzzing, the hoots of owls, and the long, strange calling sound of birds known as nightjars. Sergio knew if he wanted to catch these poachers, he could not just sit here all night hoping they made a noise. He took a deep breath, stepped off the road, and made his way into the trees. He walked quickly but carefully, moving branches aside with one hand and holding his gun with the other, constantly scanning left and right for any movement or light. And when he was about 100 feet into the trees, he finally saw something out of the corner of his eye. He caught a glint in the darkness, and for a second, it almost looked like moonlight reflecting off of something metal. And so Sergio thought that had to be the car and that he had caught them. But when Sergio turned to face them, he immediately realized there was no car. What he saw was so jarring and terrifying that for a second he just stood there, frozen to the spot. And as he did, the sounds in the forest began to amplify all around him, and he felt this panic building inside of his chest. He wanted to scream, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. A few minutes later, an off-duty police officer who was friendly with Sergio was heading to bed in his home when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw it was Sergio calling him. So he opened his phone and said hello, but Sergio did not say hello back to him. Instead, in a voice that was unusually cold and monotone, Sergio just said, "Come to Las Canas, you know what to do." And before this other officer could ask Sergio what he meant, the line just went dead. The officer tried to call Sergio back, but Sergio did not answer. The officer really had no idea what was going on here. This was exceptionally odd behavior by Sergio, and so this officer felt compelled to call it into headquarters just in case. The off-duty police officer stared at his phone in disbelief. He tried calling Sergio back 4 or 5 times, but each time it went straight to a busy signal or just kept ringing. The cold, monotone voice lingered in his head, sounding almost like Sergio was speaking under hypnosis or being forced to read a script. It was a voice stripped of all emotion, which was terrifying because Sergio was normally a very lively and expressive person. Knowing that Sergio was patrolling alone in one of the most remote and desolate sectors of the district, the officer knew he could not just ignore this. He got out of bed, threw on his uniform, and decided to call the station. When he explained the situation to the dispatcher's voice tensed up. The dispatcher explained that they had already lost contact with Sergio's radio. In a small, tight-knit department, a lost officer is everyone's worst nightmare. The dispatcher had already sent 3 patrol units to the coordinates Sergio had given during his initial call. The off-duty officer decided he could not sit at home, so he got into his personal vehicle and started driving towards Las Cañas himself, praying that his friend was just having radio trouble and nothing more. But when this officer got the dispatcher on the phone, the dispatcher told him they actually already had backup on their way to Sergio right now. And the dispatcher told him that they were actually pretty worried about Sergio too, because after Sergio's first radio call had come in where he gave his location and asked for backup, they had lost contact with him entirely. Every time they had tried to call him back, he was not answering. Meanwhile, the backup, which consisted of 3 police cars full of heavily armed officers, sped past vast cornfields into the remote area that contained Las Cañas where Sergio had last been. And when they got to the actual spot on the road where Sergio had said he was, they found his motorcycle parked neatly, but Sergio was nowhere to be found, and nobody else was there either. It was just this lone motorcycle. And so the 3 cars pulled over near the motorcycle and the officers got out. One of the officers tried again to hail Sergio on the radio, but again they were met with absolute silence. And so they all fanned out with their flashlights and began searching this road up and down looking for any sign of Sergio in the dark. And after a minute or two, one of the officers spotted this cluster of metal in the sand by the side of the road. Now, this officer did not immediately connect whatever this metal was with whatever happened to Sergio. They just walked over to see what it was. But when he actually reached it and shone his light directly on it, he gasped and called out to the other officers, telling them to come over. Because these pieces of metal definitely had something to do with Sergio. They were the completely disassembled parts of Sergio's radio and his gun. The pieces were lying in a neat pile in the sand, with the small screws and internal components laid out meticulously, which made no logical sense. This discovery immediately launched a major police search operation. More backup poured into Las Cañas, and officers teamed up and continued to search the dark area. And pretty quickly, officers found what looked like Sergio's footprints heading away from the road and into the cluster of trees. So the officers began to follow them. However, after getting about 100 feet into the trees following these footsteps, they noticed something very strange. The footprints were getting further and further apart. At first, the officers thought that maybe Sergio began sprinting and taking really big, long strides. But as they continued following these steps through the trees and out the backside into this big field, the distance between these steps continued to get bigger and bigger. Soon, the distance between each footprint was 10 feet, then 15 feet, and then 20 feet. Even if Sergio had been sprinting at full speed and literally leaping, this was too big of a distance for any person to cover. This was literally humanly impossible. The police officers following these prints looked at each other uneasily. Each footprint was perfectly clear in the soft ground, and there was no mistaking this was Sergio's boot. And then also, they were certain they were not missing prints in between the ones they could see. They really were spaced this far apart, as if he was being carried or thrown. The officers had been talking to each other when they began following these prints, but now they just walked in absolute silence, overwhelmed by the eerie nature of the trail. For more than a mile, they tracked Sergio's bizarre, seemingly impossible trail through open fields and clusters of trees until they arrived at a large cornfield. And then suddenly, the trail of footprints just stopped. The last clear mark was a deep imprint of his right boot, and then nothing. It was like Sergio had pushed off his right foot and then just vanished into the air. The search for Sergio went on all night, despite the fact that it started to pour rain at around 2 o'clock in the morning, making the search conditions miserable. The officers never gave up, shining their flashlights through the mud and rain. However, beyond those footsteps, they never found any other trace of Sergio. And there was one other thing police could not find. There was absolutely no sign of the poachers that Sergio had called in before he had vanished. There were no tire tracks from any vehicle other than Sergio's motorcycle. There was no broken vegetation or anything like that. It looked like no car had ever been driven into these trees. And there were no signs of any kind of struggle either that would explain why Sergio was gone and why his gun and radio were disassembled by the side of the road. The whole situation just made absolutely no sense. At 4:30 in the afternoon on March 3rd, 2006, so roughly 18 hours after Sergio had disappeared, a farmer was walking on his property about 12 miles away from Las Cañas when he looked up ahead and saw this dark figure sitting by the side of the road. The farmer squinted to get a better look, and the figure looked like a man, but he was all curled up into a ball and he was sitting directly in the mud. Now, keep in mind this area is deep in the middle of nowhere, and so this farmer did not get a lot of people passing through his land. And so to see anybody out here was pretty rare, let alone what he was seeing now. And so feeling curious, the farmer called out to this man but did not get any response. And so he just started walking towards him. And when he got up close, he saw this man was a police officer in full uniform. He had his knees pulled up to his chest with his arms wrapped tightly around them, and his head was buried in his lap, and so the farmer could not see his face. And weirdly, even though it had only recently stopped raining and the ground that the officer was sitting on was still wet and muddy, this man and his uniform were totally dry, with no mud or water on his clothes. The farmer leaned down and gently put his hand on the man's shoulder and asked if he was okay. But the officer did not react at all. He just stayed there motionless, head in his lap, not reacting, totally silent. And this was just too strange. The farmer backed away, took out his phone, and he called the police. It did not take long for the police to show up and identify this seated police officer as Sergio Poeta. But Sergio would not talk to the police any more than he would speak to the farmer. He did not appear to be physically injured, but there was definitely something wrong with his mental state. So the officers called an ambulance and they summoned Sergio's boss, the police chief, to see if he could get Sergio to respond in any way. And when Sergio's boss showed up, he was able to coax Sergio up off the wet ground, but still Sergio would not speak a single word. All he would do is give his boss a big hug and just break down and cry. So his boss led Sergio over to the ambulance, which had just arrived, and he got him in the back and he sat with him, and then he went with Sergio to the hospital and followed him into his exam room. At first, inside the exam room, Sergio did not want anybody to touch him and he was very anxious and paranoid. He kept squinting and grimacing every time the lights were put on him as if they were causing him physical pain. But after a few minutes, he did let the doctors and nurses remove his clothes and examine his body for wounds. Sergio's boss had expected that Sergio would have severe injuries. He figured he had likely been assaulted, beaten, or kidnapped by aggressive poachers. But as he watched the doctors and nurses check Sergio out, it was very clear that Sergio did not have any external injuries. There were no bruises, no cuts, and no sign of any physical struggle at all. And not only that, as the nurse took Sergio's vitals, it was clear that he was not dehydrated or sick at all, despite the fact he had just been missing for 18 hours with no food or water supplies. The only injury the medical team did find on Sergio was to his feet, but it did not help clarify anything. When they removed Sergio's boots and socks, they found these bizarre, deep burns on the soles of his feet. It looked like he had been standing directly on an incredibly hot surface. Over the next couple of hours, Sergio did finally begin to talk, and here is the totally wild story that he told the investigators. At 10 o'clock the night before, when Sergio had followed the poachers into the trees, he had been absolutely certain that he had seen the metal of the poacher's car reflecting the moonlight. However, he did not. There was no car, and there were no poachers. When he turned to face the clearing, all he saw in the darkness were two sets of burning red eyes staring back at him. Sergio stood there completely stunned, unsure who or what these eyes belonged to. And then, before he could do anything, the eyes began to glide closer to him. And as they did, Sergio realized with growing horror that these were not human eyes. These were not animal eyes. These eyes belonged to some creature he had never seen before in his entire life. All he could make out beyond the burning red eyes were these slim gray bodies with big heads and long skinny fingers, and they did not appear to blink at all. Sergio opened his mouth to scream, but when he did, no sound came out. And that was when Sergio realized that not only could he not scream, but he no longer was able to move. He was completely paralyzed. But then suddenly, he felt this intense pressure in his torso and his back sort of involuntarily arched in response. He tried to wrench himself free of whatever invisible force seemed to be in control of him, but he could not. It felt like his spine was going to snap. And then he felt himself begin to walk out of the forest backwards. His back was arched in this totally unnatural position, and he was marching out of the trees, completely unable to stop his own legs from moving. And then as he was doing this, he walked helplessly as one of his hands went down and pulled out his phone, and then he dialed the number of that officer. And then this detached, cold voice came out of Sergio's mouth, telling his friend to come to Las Cañas, saying that he knew what to do. And as Sergio continued to walk in this bizarre bent-over gait, he felt himself reach for his gun. And after he drew it, he watched in horror as his hands fully disassembled it and dropped the pieces on the ground, and then he watched himself do the exact same thing with his radio. And the whole time, these red-eyed creatures were just a few feet away, staring at him. It was only after Sergio had disarmed himself that he felt that intense pressure on him subside, and he realized this was his chance to escape. He took off running, but after only going a few steps, he felt himself get hit from behind, and he pitched forward. He thought he was falling, but he did not hit the ground. Instead, it was like he was being lifted up into the sky. And for a moment, he just careened through the air until abruptly, whatever force was holding him up let go. He fell to the ground and somehow managed to land on his feet, but then once again he was lifted back up, and this time he was thrown even farther through the air before he hit the ground. And then it happened again and again and again. And so as this was happening, Sergio realized these red-eyed creatures must be the ones in control, and they were playing with him. They knew he was trying to escape, but they did not stop him. They just kept picking him up and throwing him forward over and over again. And as all this happened, Sergio began to feel his feet burn. The last thing he remembered was running through a cornfield, and as he did, he realized suddenly that it seemed like he was all alone. The red-eyed creatures were gone. And so Sergio looked over his shoulder, and all he saw was swaying corn stalks in darkness, and for a moment he thought that maybe this was all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. He felt the ground beneath him, and he realized that this was all over. But then, still running, he turned to look straight ahead, and he saw there was this incredible wall of just pure darkness. There was no cornfield, no ground at all. In fact, there was no sky, no moon, no stars, nothing. It was just pure black, like he had reached the actual edge of the world. And then once again, he felt himself begin to rise into the air, and he looked down into this darkness, into this void, and staring back at him were two red, glowing eyes. After that, Sergio passed out, and he had no idea how he wound up 18 hours later on the side of the road, absolutely frozen in fear. No one has ever been able to explain what happened to Sergio, including Sergio himself, but it should be noted that Argentina and South America more broadly is a very well-known hotbed of paranormal activity. Following this incident, Sergio was so traumatized that he retired from the police force. To this day, cops and locals still report seeing strange lights in and around Las Cañas. They wonder if whatever took Sergio Poeta that night is still out there, waiting in the dark forest. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short, a lone cop vanished after following red taillights into a dark Argentine forest. Corporal Sergio Poeta was the victim, found 18 hours later, dry, silent, and curled beside a road 12 miles away. The strangest clue? His gun and radio were perfectly disassembled, and his footprints stretched 20 feet apart. Police suspected poachers, but there were no tire marks, no car, no struggle. Then Sergio finally spoke. He claimed red-eyed creatures froze his body, controlled his hands, and threw him through the night. He retired soon after. Locals still see strange lights near Las Cañas. What really took him? Watch the full story on our channel. Tab 1 every year, dozens of people, from experienced hikers and hunters to casual backpackers, venture deep into the vast wilderness of North America and then come back out claiming to have seen something completely unbelievable. They tell stories of a massive bipedal creature, standing anywhere from 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in thick, dark hair. It is described as a creature that seems to be a strange cross between a man and a beast. There have been literally thousands of these sightings reported all over the continent. And so, despite the sheer number of reports, there has never been a single piece of undeniable physical proof. Because of this, Bigfoot has become one of our greatest urban legends. But no matter how you personally feel about Bigfoot, whether you believe it exists or you think it is completely made up, some of the first-hand accounts are absolutely terrifying. One account in particular stands out as being incredibly eerie, and it comes directly out of the state of Oregon. Oregon is known as a major hotspot for these kinds of sightings, especially the dense, northwestern section of the state, where the forests are thick, rugged, and largely untouched by civilization. This is the story of a man named Jeff Boiler. Jeff was a highly practical, grounded individual. He had served in the United States Marine Corps, where he was trained in land navigation, survival, and staying calm under extreme pressure. After his military service, he became a municipal police officer and later a deputy sheriff. Eventually, he would study law and become an attorney. Jeff was a man whose entire career was built on facts, evidence, and logical observation. When you hear him talk about his experience, he does not try to dress it up or make it sound dramatic. He simply tells you what happened to him step by step as he remembers it. He does not try to push a theory or convince you that monsters are real. He just lays out the facts, which makes his story all the more believable and deeply unsettling. Back in 1997, Jeff Boiler was a fit, single man in his late 20s. He had recently finished his time in the Marine Corps and had spent some years working as a police officer. At this point in his life, Jeff was looking for a fresh start. He had always possessed a deep love for nature, hiking, and hunting, so he made the decision to move out to Oregon. He did not have a clear plan for what he was going to do for work, but he knew he wanted to be surrounded by the wild beauty of the Pacific Northwest. Not long after he arrived, one of his close friends, who happened to be the elected sheriff of a very rural county in northwestern Oregon, reached out to him. The sheriff knew about Jeff's impressive background in the military and law enforcement. He asked Jeff if he would be interested in joining the department as a deputy sheriff. It was a perfect fit. Jeff accepted the offer, and within a few weeks he was out on patrol, exploring the rugged terrain of his new home. After a couple of months on the job, Jeff was incredibly happy. He loved the community, the pristine landscape, and the daily routine of being a deputy. One afternoon, Jeff finished his shift a bit earlier than usual. He stepped outside the station and noticed that it was an absolutely gorgeous day. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and the sun was shining brightly. Initially, he had planned to just drive back to his house and relax, but looking at the weather, he realized it was far too beautiful of a day to waste indoors. He decided he wanted to go on a hike. But Jeff did not want to go to a popular trail where he would run into crowds of tourists. He wanted to go to a very specific, hard-to-reach section of the Cascade Mountains. This particular area held a deep, personal meaning for him. 20 years earlier, one of his very close friends had passed away, and his remains had been laid to rest in an unmarked grave deep in these mountains. Jeff had not visited the site in a very long time, and he thought that today would be the perfect opportunity to make the trek up the mountain, locate the grave, and pay his respects in the quiet of the forest. He went out to his driveway, hopped into his Jeep, and started driving toward the edge of the mountains. The area he was heading into was completely wild. It was an unmarked, isolated section of the Cascade Range. This was the kind of terrain where there are no clear paths, no signs, and no safety nets. Jeff would later describe this part of the forest as a place that felt completely ancient. When you walk through it, the canopy of massive trees was so thick that it blocked out much of the sunlight, creating a quiet, shadow-filled world beneath the branches. It was a place where you could easily look around and wonder if any other human being had ever set foot on the ground beneath you. It was completely untamed. Jeff arrived at a small, empty dirt turnout that sat right on the edge of the forest. He parked his Jeep, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment in the silence. He pulled out a paper topographical map and carefully plotted his route. Since there were no established trails leading up to his friend's grave, he had to rely entirely on his map-reading skills and his compass to navigate the steep, rugged slopes. He folded the map, put it in his pocket, grabbed his gear, and stepped into the thick tree line. He began his hike up the mountain. For the first 2 hours, the hike was incredibly demanding. The terrain was steep, filled with loose rocks, thick undergrowth, and fallen logs that he had to constantly climb over. It was exhausting work. As he pushed higher up the mountain, Jeff realized that the route he had plotted was becoming too difficult to traverse safely. He decided he needed to deviate from his original plan. He pulled out his map and looked for an alternative route. He noticed that running parallel to his current position, further up the mountain, there seemed to be a natural clearing, a flatter strip of land that would make the ascent much easier. It would take some physical effort to cut across the steep slope to reach this clearing, but once he was there, it would be a straight shot up to the general area of the grave. Before making his move toward this new path, Jeff stopped by a small, crystal-clear freshwater stream that was bubbling down the mountainside. He knelt down on the damp earth, scooped up some of the freezing water, and splashed it onto his face to cool off. He took a long drink of the fresh water, wiping his brow. He knew that deviating from his planned route in an unmarked wilderness was a risky move, especially in 1997, when there were no cell phones with GPS navigation or satellite rescue beacons. He had to be absolutely precise with his coordinates. He pulled out his map one more time, verified his position, and then pulled out his compass. To make sure he stayed on course as he moved sideways across the mountain, Jeff decided to take an azimuth. This is a standard military land navigation technique where you hold the compass up to your eye, align the sight with a prominent landmark in the distance, and follow that exact bearing. Jeff raised the compass to his face, closed one eye, and peered through the sighting mechanism. As he was looking through the sights, adjusting his angle, something caught his eye. Just to the right of his line of sight, about 20 feet above him on a rocky outcropping, there was a large tree next to a massive boulder. And right behind that tree, someone was standing, watching him. Jeff slowly lowered his compass. He did not immediately panic. He was in the middle of nowhere, miles from any road, but it was broad daylight, and his first thought was that another hiker or perhaps a hunter had wandered into the area. He looked closely at the figure behind the tree. He could see the outline of a head and shoulders peeking out from behind the trunk. He could clearly see two eyes staring directly down at him. Out of pure instinct, Jeff tilted his head to the side, a universal gesture of confusion, as if to say, "Who are you and what are you doing up there?" As soon as Jeff tilted his head, the figure behind the tree mimicked him. It tilted its head to the exact same angle, watching him. Then, the figure took a step out from behind the tree, revealing its full form. Jeff's heart skipped a beat and his breath caught in his throat. This was not a hiker. This was not a hunter in camouflage. Standing on the rocky ledge above him was a massive, towering figure. It was easily 8 feet tall, incredibly broad, and covered from head to toe in thick, dark, matted hair. It possessed a powerful, heavy build with long arms and a face that looked like a strange, unsettling blend of human and animal features. It stood perfectly still, looking down at Jeff with a calm, intense focus. Jeff stood frozen. Every single instinct he had as a Marine and a police officer screamed at him that he was in extreme danger. He was looking at something that defied everything he knew about the world. Instinctively, his right hand reached down to his hip to draw his service pistol. But because he was wearing a heavy-duty holster with a safety strap, and because his hands were suddenly shaking from the massive rush of adrenaline, he couldn't get the weapon free. He was fumbling with the leather strap, desperately trying to release his gun, all while keeping his eyes locked on the massive creature standing just 50 feet away from him. The creature did not move, it just stood there, its head still tilted, watching Jeff struggle with his holster. Realizing he couldn't free the gun without looking down, Jeff finally tore his eyes away from the creature for a split second to look at his holster and release the safety catch. He grabbed the grip, drew his pistol, and instantly snapped his head back up to aim at the ledge. But the ledge was empty. The giant, hairy creature had completely vanished. There was no sound of crashing brush, no snapping twigs, and no footsteps. It was as if the massive 8-foot-tall being had simply dissolved into the air. Jeff stood there in the absolute silence of the forest, his heart hammering against his ribs, his gun raised and pointed at the empty rocky outcropping. He was completely bewildered. He began to question his own senses. He wondered if the heat, the physical exhaustion of the steep climb, or his own imagination had caused him to hallucinate. He was a practical man, a deputy sheriff, and he did not want to believe that he had just lost his mind. He needed to find a logical explanation. He looked around and noticed a tall pine tree nearby with low-hanging, sturdy branches. Jeff figured that if he climbed up this tree, he could get an elevated vantage point that would allow him to look over the top of the rocky outcropping and see into the forest behind it. He holstered his weapon, approached the tree, and began to climb. He went up about 15 or 20 feet until he was level with the top of the ledge. He peered out across the rocky ground. The terrain stretched back into a dense, thick stand of timber. He scanned the area intensely, looking for any sign of movement, any flash of dark hair, or any sound of something moving through the trees. But there was absolutely nothing. The forest was completely still. The silence was heavy and oppressive. Jeff climbed back down the tree, his mind spinning. Despite his growing unease, his training kicked in. He wanted to investigate. He was armed, he was experienced, and he wanted to know if there was any physical evidence of what he had just seen. He decided to climb up the steep, rocky slope to the exact spot where the creature had been standing. He scrambled up the rocks and reached the ledge. He walked over to the tree and the boulder. He searched the ground for footprints, broken branches, or any physical trace. He leaned in, trying to catch a scent, thinking a wild animal would leave a strong, musky odor behind. But there was nothing. No footprints on the hard, pine needle-covered ground, no broken twigs, no smell. It was completely clean. Since the rocky outcropping dead-ended at a sheer cliff face, Jeff realized that if the creature had run away, it could only have gone inland, deeper into the forest and up the side of the mountain. He decided to follow in that general direction, moving cautiously, keeping his ears open for any sound that might indicate which way the figure had gone. As he walked, his training as a police officer took over. He searched the forest floor for any disturbed earth, bent twigs, or signs of passage, but the ground was dry and covered in a thick layer of pine needles that showed no obvious tracks. After about an hour of walking and searching, Jeff stopped and looked around. The thick canopy of the forest made it difficult to see far in any direction, and the landmarks on his topographical map were starting to look unfamiliar. He looked at his map, then at his compass, and then scanned the rugged terrain around him. It was a cold, sinking feeling that settled in his stomach. He was lost. In his single-minded pursuit of the creature, he had completely lost track of his position. And to make matters worse, as he looked up through the breaks in the trees, he realized that he had also completely lost track of time. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the bright daylight was quickly being replaced by the deep shadows of twilight. Jeff did not have a flashlight with him. He had no overnight gear, no sleeping bag, and no extra warm clothing to survive the freezing temperatures that would soon settle over the mountains. He was completely alone, miles away from his vehicle with no survival supplies, in the middle of a vast wilderness where people frequently vanished without a trace. A wave of panic washed over him, but he fought to control it. He knew that letting panic take over would only lead to poor decisions and make his situation far more dangerous. He took a few deep breaths, closed his eyes for a moment, and forced himself to focus. He decided that his best course of action was to abandon the search for the creature and simply try to backtrack toward the general direction of his Jeep. He turned around and began to walk back through the trees, trying to follow the path he believed he had taken. He had only been walking for a few minutes when a sudden, massive sound shattered the quiet of the forest. From directly behind him, there was a deafening, explosive crack. It was the sound of a massive tree being violently snapped in half and crashing down to the forest floor. The sound was incredibly loud, far louder than any standard gunshot, echoing off the nearby mountainsides like a clap of thunder. Jeff immediately spun around, pulling his gun from his holster and aiming it into the dark trees. He waited for another sound, expecting to see a giant pine tree falling toward him, but the forest was silent once again. He stared into the shadows, his eyes wide, trying to see what had caused such a massive tree to break. He could see nothing. He tried to remain logical. He told himself that old, rotting trees fall all the time in the forest, and that it was purely a coincidence that it happened right as he was walking by. He told himself he was lucky the tree hadn't fallen on top of him, and that there was no reason to think it was connected to the strange creature he had seen earlier. But despite his attempts to stay rational, his survival instincts were telling him a very different story. He began walking faster, but then another massive tree snapped and fell, this time ahead of him and to his right. A third tree then shattered violently on his left, much closer to his position than the previous ones. He realized with absolute horror that he was being actively herded by a creature that was moving silently and at impossible speeds. Utterly panicked and fearing for his life, Jeff took off into a full sprint straight down the rugged mountain slope. As he ran, the forest around him erupted. Trees were being snapped and crashed down on his left and right, flanking him as he fled. He fell and scraped himself, scrambling back up in terror. After 30 minutes of running, he burst into a clearing and saw a deer. The deer was frozen, staring in absolute terror at the tree line just behind Jeff. The deer bolted, and another tree crashed down nearby. Jeff sprinted the final half-mile through the thick brush to reach the safety of his parked Jeep. He fumbled with his keys, managed to unlock the door, jumped inside, locked the doors, and drove away in a panic. He drove straight to the sheriff's department. His clothes were completely torn, his hands were bloody from his falls, and his body was shaking violently. He told his friend, the sheriff, everything. The sheriff didn't laugh. He explained that in this remote section of the Cascades, they received identical reports all the time from hunters and loggers. He believed Jeff, but knew no investigation could be done. Decades later, Jeff, now a successful lawyer, shared his story. He had no reason to lie, and his background as a Marine and police officer made him highly credible. His encounter remains one of the most chilling accounts of the wilderness, leaving us with a haunting reminder of the unexplained mysteries that wait in the deep, ancient woods of northwestern Oregon. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Short deep in Oregon's ancient Cascade forests, a former Marine and deputy sheriff named Jeff Boiler, but then something watched him from behind a tree. It was no hiker, 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, and terrifyingly silent. When Jeff reached for his gun, it vanished without a trace. Moments later, trees began snapping around him, as if something invisible was driving him down the mountain. Was it Bigfoot, a predator, or something worse? Jeff escaped, but the forest kept its secret. Watch the full story on our channel. Day 1 in the early afternoon of April 13, 1985, a 60-year-old woman named Dorothy Thompson stepped into a small bank in St. Bernard, Louisiana. The cool air inside did little to ease the pain in her hip as she slowly crossed the lobby toward the teller line. She kept her eyes forward, pretending not to notice the stairs, but in a town like St. Bernard, people always noticed Dorothy Thompson. Some whispered that the old woman who lived in the pet cemetery was cursed. Others claimed the land itself was haunted. And whenever her name came up, the conversation almost always circled back to the same disturbing fact. Both of Dorothy's husbands had died on her property. As the murmurs spread quietly through the bank, Dorothy reached the counter and asked to withdraw some cash. It should have been an ordinary errand. Just another quiet afternoon in Louisiana. Instead, it would be the last normal thing Dorothy Thompson ever did. And the reason the town had feared her for years was far darker than anyone realized. She couldn't deny she'd given them plenty to talk about. Dorothy had lived in St. Bernard for nearly 4 decades. She was the owner and sole resident of the local pet cemetery. It was a legitimate business, a place where grieving pet owners could buy a small plot of land to lay their beloved animals to rest. But it wasn't just the unusual business that made her the center of so much speculation. It was the fact that she lived there, all alone, on a piece of land that many people believed was haunted. The ghost stories weren't just about the animals buried in the cemetery. They were about people. Specifically, they were about Dorothy's 2 husbands, both of whom had died on that very property. Her first husband had been a heavy drinker, and his drinking often turned to violence directed at Dorothy. The abuse became so severe that one day, Dorothy had to defend herself. She shot and killed him. The official ruling was self-defense, but in the court of public opinion, the story was much darker. Then, her second husband had taken his own life. Dorothy was the one who found him on their porch. These 2 deaths, back to back, had sealed her reputation. People in town whispered that she was a husband killer, some kind of black widow living amongst the graves of cats and dogs. What the townspeople didn't see or didn't want to see was the immense toll all this tragedy had taken on her. The weight of it all was crushing. When her mother passed away about 6 years prior, it had nearly shattered her completely. Dorothy and her mother had been incredibly close, and losing her sent Dorothy into a spiral of depression so deep she had to be hospitalized for a long time. She was doing better now, but the sadness was a constant companion, some days heavier than others. So, standing in the bank, Dorothy did her best to ignore the stares and the whispers. She walked up to the teller and smiled politely. She needed to withdraw some cash to pay her new handyman, a man named Kenny Palmier. He had done some work on the cemetery grounds that morning, and since Dorothy didn't drive, Kenny was also acting as her driver for the day. He was waiting for her outside in his car right now, ready to take her on a few more errands. Dorothy told the teller the amount she needed. The woman counted out the bills, slid them under the partition, and Dorothy took the cash, turned and walked back out into the Louisiana heat, the whispers of the town fading behind her. A couple of hours later, around 4 in the afternoon, Dorothy sat quietly in the passenger seat of Kenny Palmier's car. They were driving down the highway, heading back to her home. They had just finished up at the grocery store, the last stop on their list of errands. The car was filled with the smell of fresh produce and cleaning supplies. They made small talk, the easy, impersonal kind you make with someone you don't know very well. They talked about the weather, how warm it was for April, and about the work Kenny had done that morning, clearing some overgrown brush near the back fence of the cemetery. The truth was, Dorothy barely knew Kenny at all. She had only hired him the day before. He seemed like a decent, hard-working man, and she was hopeful that he would stick around for a while. She'd had a string of bad luck with handymen over the past year or so. The turnover rate was high, and she desperately needed some consistency. The pet cemetery was a large piece of land, and both the grounds and her house required constant upkeep, work that she was no longer physically capable of doing herself. Besides her bad hip, the medication she took for her depression often left her feeling weak and disoriented. Sometimes, she would ask her neighbors for help with small tasks, but for the bigger jobs, she preferred to hire people. It felt better that way, providing someone with steady work in exchange for the help she needed. The problem was, a few of her recent hires had been less than trustworthy. Last fall, her handyman was a man named Elkin Childress. He had lived with her on the property while he worked, but he spent more time wandering around the grounds, exploring, than he did actually working. She later found out he'd been arrested for robbery, and she suspected he had been casing her property, looking for things to steal, or a way to break in. He ended up quitting before she had the chance to fire him, which was a relief. The handyman before Elkin had been even worse. His name was Brandon Naudier. Brandon was a loud, abrasive man who had started working for Dorothy right after her mother's death. He and his wife, Bonnie, had moved in with Dorothy. The arrangement was that Brandon would handle the repairs and maintenance, and Bonnie would help by driving Dorothy to her appointments. But just like with Elkin, the Naudiers turned out to be thieves, only their theft was on a much grander scale. The previous spring, Dorothy had gone through a particularly severe depressive episode. She was heavily medicated, leaving her groggy and not thinking clearly. During that time, the Naudiers had managed to convince her to sell them her land, the entire pet cemetery, and her house for a fraction of what it was worth. When the fog of the medication finally lifted and Dorothy understood what she had done, she was horrified. She immediately hired a lawyer, had the Naudiers move out, and began the process of overturning the sale. For the past year, she had been locked in a nasty legal battle with them. She knew that Brandon and Bonnie were furious with her, and Brandon, true to his nature, couldn't keep his mouth shut. He was telling anyone who would listen about their dispute, trying to paint her as the villain. He even kept contacting her directly, trying to bully or sweet-talk her into dropping the lawsuit, but Dorothy refused to back down. That cemetery, that land, it had belonged to her mother. It was her home and her legacy. She wasn't going to let anyone cheat her out of it. Now, sitting in Kenny's car, Dorothy watched the familiar scenery pass by. Kenny turned off the main highway onto the smaller road that led to her property. He then turned into her long driveway, which wound its way through a thick grove of trees, isolating her home from the rest of the world. As they got closer, the first of the small weathered tombstones came into view. The cemetery was huge, a final resting place for almost any kind of animal you could imagine. There were simple, engraved stone markers and much more elaborate monuments. One of her favorites was a human-sized statue of a Buddha, a memorial for someone's beloved pet cat. Kenny pulled the car up in front of her small house and killed the engine. He got out and came around to help her with the groceries, carrying the heavy bags inside and setting them on her kitchen counter. When everything was inside, Dorothy carefully counted out the cash she owed him from the bank withdrawal earlier. She handed it to him and said she'd call when she had more work for him to do. She stood in her doorway and watched as he got back into his car and drove away, his taillights disappearing down the long wooded driveway. Later that night, around 9 o'clock, Dorothy poured herself a generous glass of red wine. She made her way to her bedroom, sat on the edge of her bed, and turned on the small television on her dresser. It had been a long day. After Kenny had left, she'd spent the evening sorting through a pile of bills and taking a few calls from clients who wanted to inquire about burial plots. She was exhausted and ready to unwind. But just as she settled into her pillows, the phone in the kitchen started ringing. With a groan, she picked up her wine glass and shuffled back down the hallway. She answered the phone, and on the other end was the familiar voice of her friend Patricia Newman. Patricia was about half Dorothy's age, a woman in her early 30s. They had met through a mutual friend about 3 years earlier. At first, Patricia had been more of a caretaker to Dorothy, since she had experience working with the elderly. But they had clicked instantly, and their relationship had blossomed into a close friendship, something akin to a mother and daughter. Patricia lived only about 10 minutes away, and Dorothy had come to rely on her for all sorts of things, from supervising her daily medications to driving her to doctor's appointments. Patricia was one of the few people Dorothy truly trusted and spent significant time with, outside of the handyman she hired. That was why Patricia was calling tonight. She wanted to confirm if Dorothy still needed a ride to the pharmacy the next day. Dorothy told her yes, she did, and thanked her for remembering. They chatted for a few more minutes about nothing in particular before saying their goodnights. After she hung up, Dorothy stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment. She topped off her wine glass and listened to the sound of the crickets chirping outside her window. The house was so isolated, the night sounds were all she could hear. She was just about to head back to bed when another sound cut through the chirping of the crickets. It was the low rumble of a car engine coming slowly up her long driveway. The next morning, a little after 1 in the afternoon, Patricia Newman pulled her car up to Dorothy's house and put it in park. She had tried calling Dorothy around 9 that morning to let her know she was running a little late, but Dorothy hadn't picked up. Patricia tried calling a few more times throughout the morning, but each call went straight to the ringing with no answer. A knot of anxiety began to form in her stomach. Dorothy was in her 60s, a heavy drinker, and on a cocktail of strong medications. Patricia couldn't shake the feeling that Dorothy might have had an accident or some kind of medical emergency. So she wasn't here just to take Dorothy to the pharmacy anymore. She was here to make sure her friend was okay. Patricia got out of her car and walked quickly to the front door. She knocked loudly, then waited. There was no answer. She peered through the front window, but she couldn't see any movement inside. The house was dark and still. She went back to the front door and tried the knob, but it was locked. She knocked again, louder this time, calling out Dorothy's name. After several more minutes, with no response, no sound, no sign of life from within the house, Patricia's worry turned to real fear. She walked back to her car, her mind racing, and drove to a nearby phone to call the police. A short time later, Patricia was back at Dorothy's house, standing anxiously on the lawn as two St. Bernard Sheriff's deputies worked to open the back door. They had arrived just a few minutes ago, and she had explained the situation, her voice trembling slightly. She told them how out of character this was for Dorothy and how she was convinced something was wrong. The officers had done a quick walk around the house, checking windows and doors. They found that the back door wasn't locked, but it was jammed shut, so now they were trying to force it open. After a few solid kicks, the door finally gave way with a loud crack and swung inward. The two officers entered the house with Patricia right behind them. She immediately started calling Dorothy's name, her voice echoing through the silent rooms. As she moved from the kitchen into the main living area, she heard the faint sound of a television. It was coming from Dorothy's bedroom down the hall. Hope surged through her for a moment, but when she reached the bedroom and looked inside, it was empty. The bed was made, but Dorothy was nowhere to be seen. They searched the entire house, every room, every closet, but there was no sign of her. And strangely, there was no sign of any trouble either. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no indication that someone had fallen or had a medical crisis. It was as if Dorothy had simply vanished into thin air. The two officers didn't seem to know what to make of it. From their perspective, there was no obvious crime scene, no emergency, just an elderly woman who wasn't home when she was expected to be and who had left her television on. It was odd, certainly, but not enough to trigger a major police response. But Patricia knew better. She tried to convey the depth of her concern to the officers, explaining again how Dorothy never went anywhere, how she didn't have a car, how this was completely wrong. But the officers were calm and suggested she just wait a few more days. They told her to keep trying to call, and if Dorothy didn't turn up in a day or two, she could file a formal missing persons report. So, despite her gut feeling that something terrible had happened, Patricia did as she was told. She went home and continued to call Dorothy's number, but it just rang and rang. She called the few other people Dorothy knew in town, but no one had seen or heard from her. Finally, after 4 agonizing days of silence, Patricia called the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office again. This time, her voice was filled with desperation. She begged them to do something. Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and Patricia was now absolutely certain that she was in serious trouble. Around 10:30 in the morning on that same day, 4 days after Dorothy was last heard from, Detective Brian Vallalong drove his patrol car down the long, tree-lined driveway of the pet cemetery. Sergeant Terrence Strada sat in the passenger seat beside him. They had been assigned to look into the disappearance of Dorothy Thompson. Even before arriving at the house, Vallalong felt a sense of unease. He'd lived in the area his whole life and had always been creeped out by this place, with its rows of tiny tombstones for animals. It felt isolated and strange. As they cleared the trees and the house came into view, Vallalong saw a woman standing near the front porch. She was maybe in her 30s, pacing back and forth. He guessed this must be Patricia Newman. She looked anxious and impatient, and as soon as he and Strada got out of their car, she walked right up to them. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She told them that the first officers who had come out had barely done anything, just a quick welfare check. She insisted that they needed to conduct a real search of the house and the entire property to make sure Dorothy wasn't lying hurt somewhere. Vallalong and Strada assured her they would do a thorough search, but first they needed to get the full story from her. They asked her to start from the beginning and tell them about the last time she had any contact with Dorothy. Patricia seemed irritated by the request. She said she had already explained everything on the phone and to the first 2 officers. She just wanted them to start looking. But Vallalong was firm. He explained that he needed to hear it directly from her to make sure he didn't miss any details. So, reluctantly, Patricia recounted the events. She told them about the phone call on the night of the 13th to confirm the pharmacy trip. She told them about her unanswered calls the next morning and her growing sense of dread. She described finding the house empty, the TV on, the back door jammed. She reiterated that she was now convinced something bad had happened to Dorothy and that she needed their help to find her. Vallalong listened patiently, then asked if Dorothy had any other friends or family she might have gone to visit. Patricia shook her head emphatically. She explained that Dorothy was a loner, that she almost never left her property. She didn't drive and had no car. Patricia then looked Valalong straight in the eye and said she believed the only way Dorothy would have left her house that night was if someone had forced her to. Valalong exchanged a look with Strata. He didn't dismiss Patricia's fears, but he knew they needed to proceed based on evidence, not just gut feelings. He asked Patricia to show them the back door that had been jammed, and they would begin their search there. A few moments later, Valalong stepped through the back doorway into Dorothy's house, with Strata and Patricia following. As he walked through the rooms, he saw that Patricia had been right. The house was incredibly neat. There was absolutely no sign of a struggle. This seemed to contradict the idea of a forced abduction. But then again, Dorothy was an older, frail woman. Valalong considered that she could have been overpowered quickly, without much of a fight. He also noted that nothing of value seemed to be missing. The television was still in the bedroom and other personal items were untouched. It didn't look like a robbery. But unlike the first officers, Valalong agreed that something was very wrong here. As he continued his search, he saw more and more signs that Dorothy had not planned to be away from home. There was the half-empty glass of wine on the kitchen counter. The television was still on. These were the actions of someone who expected to be right back, not someone who had planned a trip or was leaving for an extended period. And Patricia had already confirmed that there was no family emergency or last-minute vacation. Valalong paused his search and turned to Patricia. He asked her about Dorothy's mental state. Patricia hesitated for a moment before admitting that Dorothy was on a lot of medication and that it sometimes made her confused and disoriented. This opened up a new possibility for Valalong. Perhaps Dorothy, in a confused state, had simply wandered off on her own. She could have walked out the back door and then gotten lost or hurt on the vast wooded property. The back door had been unlocked, after all. Even though it was jammed, it obviously wasn't impossible to open from the inside. Maybe it just got stuck when it was closed from the outside. He shared this theory with Strata. It was time to expand the search. Dorothy clearly wasn't in the house. Now they had to search the grounds. 15 days later, on the morning of May 3rd, 1985, Detective Valalong walked into Sergeant Strata's office to go over the case. By this point, Valalong was almost certain that Dorothy Thompson had been a victim of foul play. They had conducted multiple extensive searches of her house and the entire pet cemetery property. They had used search dogs and brought in volunteers. They found nothing. No sign of Dorothy and no clues to explain where she had gone. Patricia had told them that Dorothy had a small tattoo of a cross on her left index finger. Valalong had spent the better part of the last 2 weeks on the phone, calling every hospital and morgue in the region to see if a woman matching Dorothy's description and with that specific tattoo had been admitted or brought in. He had also interviewed Dorothy's neighbors, the tellers at the bank she'd visited, and a handful of other people in town who knew her. He had tracked down and spoken with her new handyman, Kenny Palmier, who confirmed he had dropped her off at home around 4 in the afternoon on the day she disappeared. But no one had seen or heard from Dorothy since that day. While no one could provide any useful information about her whereabouts, nearly everyone Valalong spoke to had a strong and usually negative opinion of her. They called her a recluse, crazy. They repeated the old rumors about her murdering her husbands and burying them on the property. They talked about how the cemetery was haunted, the stories were pervasive, but none of them offered a tangible lead for a homicide investigation. The only promising piece of information Valalong had uncovered came from Dorothy's lawyer a few days earlier. The lawyer had confirmed that Dorothy was in the middle of a very bitter lawsuit over the ownership of her property with 2 of her former employees, Bonnie and Brandon Naudier. With the case now looking more and more like an abduction and murder, a contentious lawsuit was a huge red flag. It provided a clear motive. Valalong knew he had to talk to the Naudiers as soon as possible. As he was laying all this out for Strata, the phone on Strata's desk rang. Strata picked it up, listened for a moment, and his expression changed completely. He looked shocked. He said a few words into the receiver, thanked the caller, and hung up. He turned to Valalong and told him that a woman's body had been pulled from the Mississippi River the day before, about 40 miles downriver from St. Bernard. They thought it might be Dorothy. Just a few hours later, Valalong and Strata stood with Patricia Newman in a sterile examination room at the coroner's office. On a long metal table in the center of the room lay the body that had been recovered from the river. Patricia had agreed to come and see if she could make an identification. But as Valalong looked at the body, he had serious doubts that a visual identification would even be possible. The body was severely decomposed and bloated from its time in the water. The medical examiner had told them the woman had likely been in the river for weeks. An autopsy was pending, but due to the state of the body, any findings would be difficult to determine with certainty. One thing was certain, however. This was a homicide. The woman had been found with a plastic bag tied tightly over her head. Her body was wrapped in numerous heavy chains, a clear attempt to weigh it down and keep it from ever being found. Valalong glanced over at Patricia. She looked pale and shaken, her eyes wide as she stared at the table. After a long, tense moment, she finally spoke. She said she didn't think it was Dorothy. For a split second, Ballalong felt a wave of disappointment. Not because he wanted Dorothy to be dead, but because a positive identification would be a major break in the case. But then, he remembered the tattoo. He stepped forward, put on a pair of latex gloves, and gently lifted the woman's left hand. And there, just faintly visible on the decomposed skin of her index finger, was the unmistakable shape of a small cross. This was her. This was Dorothy Thompson. 4 days later, on May 7th, Ballalong sat at his desk, staring at the growing case file. This was no longer a missing persons case, it was a full-blown homicide investigation. The medical examiner had completed the autopsy. He hadn't found any water in Dorothy's lungs, which meant she had not drowned. The cause of death was officially listed as asphyxia, likely from strangulation or suffocation before she was put in the river. Ballalong went back to the beginning, reviewing all his notes, looking for anything he might have missed. He started with the crime scene, or rather, the lack of one. Dorothy's house was so neat. It was possible she had been lured away from her home and killed elsewhere. But he knew from everyone he'd spoken to that Dorothy was a homebody. She didn't trust people easily and wouldn't have left with a stranger. It made more sense that she was killed in her own home, and the killer had simply been very quick and very clean, leaving no trace of a struggle. His initial suspicion had fallen on Kenny Palmier, the handyman who was the last known person to see her. But Kenny had a solid alibi for that night, and besides, Ballalong couldn't figure out a motive. There was no robbery, and Dorothy wasn't a wealthy woman. A murder this personal, by strangulation, usually pointed to a deep-seated rage or a personal conflict, but so far he hadn't found anyone who had that kind of conflict with her. People gossiped about her, they thought she was strange, but no one seemed to have a real, violent grudge against her. Except, of course, for the Naughtiers. That lawsuit was the most obvious motive he had. But he hadn't had a chance to fully investigate it yet. At this point, his biggest problem was a complete lack of evidence. There were no witnesses to the abduction. The searches of her house and property had turned up nothing, and any forensic evidence that might have been on Dorothy's body had been washed away by the Mississippi River. Just then, there was a knock on his office door. Another officer poked his head in and said there was someone in booking that Ballalong might want to talk to. They had just arrested a man for writing bad checks, and it turned out he used to work for Dorothy Thompson. Ballalong was immediately interested. The officer told him the man's name was Elkin Childress. He had been Dorothy's live-in caretaker for a couple of months the previous fall, and during his interview, Elkin had told the arresting officers that the real reason he'd taken the job at the pet cemetery was to look for buried treasure. Apparently, among all the other bizarre rumors about Dorothy, there was one about her having hundreds of thousands of dollars buried somewhere on the property. Elkin had become obsessed with finding it, though he claimed he never did. As Ballalong heard this, he felt a jolt of excitement. He'd never heard the treasure rumor before, but it provided a powerful new motive. Maybe Elkin had gone back to the property and tried to force Dorothy to tell him where the money was. But before Ballalong could get too carried away, the officer told him that Elkin had a verified alibi for the night Dorothy disappeared. However, the officer continued, Elkin had said something else that was very interesting. He claimed there was someone else in Dorothy's life who had been trying to get her money. Someone who had befriended the old woman for the sole purpose of inheriting everything she owned when she died. According to Elkin, that person was Patricia Newman. The name hit Ballalong like a ton of bricks. Why hadn't he seen it before? Patricia was the one who had reported Dorothy missing. She was the one who had pushed so hard for an investigation. At the time, he'd thought it was just a concerned friend. But now he wondered if it was an act, an attempt to make herself look innocent. It was a classic move for a killer, inserting themselves into the investigation to control the narrative and divert suspicion. And Patricia had been in Dorothy's house multiple times in the days before the body was found. She had every opportunity to clean up a crime scene or plant misleading evidence. He got up from his desk and went to find Strata. They needed to talk to Patricia Newman again, and this time she would be treated as a prime suspect. On May 8th, just one day after that conversation, Detective Ballalong sat across an interrogation table from Patricia Newman. He watched her closely. She seemed annoyed to have been called in again, but underneath the annoyance he could see she was nervous. Her hands fidgeted in her lap. Ballalong had planned his approach carefully. He would start off friendly, lulling her into a false sense of security, making her think he was still on her side. Then, he would pivot and hit her with the tough questions. He began by asking her to go over her relationship with Dorothy one more time. Patricia explained how they were close friends and how she helped care for the older woman. Ballalong nodded, pretending to be sympathetic. Then he changed the subject abruptly. He asked her about Dorothy's estate if it was valuable. Patricia said Dorothy owned the house and the land free and clear, so it had to be worth something, but she didn't know how much. Ballalong leaned forward slightly. Okay, he said, forget the financial value. Was the property worth something to you, Patricia? He saw the flicker of alarm in her eyes. She knew, in that instant, that the nature of their conversation had changed. She was no longer just a helpful witness. She quickly denied it, saying the property meant nothing to her, that she didn't want it. Then she tried to turn the tables. She told Valalong that if he was looking for someone who wanted that land, he needed to talk to the Naughtiers. Valalong stayed silent, letting her talk. Seizing the opportunity, Patricia launched into a tirade against them. She called them monsters. She said Brandon had been verbally abusive to Dorothy when he worked for her. She claimed he was the main source of the vicious rumors that circulated about Dorothy in town. But that wasn't the worst of it, she said. She then detailed the entire story of the land sale. She explained how, when Dorothy was in a fragile mental state from her depression and medication, Brandon and Bonnie had manipulated her into signing over her property for almost nothing. Valalong realized that while he knew about the lawsuit, he hadn't understood the full context, how predatory the Naughtiers' actions had been. Things had been so chaotic since Dorothy's body was found that he hadn't had a chance to follow up with Dorothy's lawyer for all the details. Patricia explained that it was she who had convinced Dorothy to fight back, to hire a lawyer and sue them. And, she added, the court date for that lawsuit had taken place just 10 days before Dorothy disappeared. Valalong couldn't believe it. The motive was so clear, so powerful. The Naughtiers stood to lose everything if Dorothy won that lawsuit. But if Dorothy suddenly disappeared, the lawsuit would likely be dismissed, and the land would be theirs by default. At that moment, his focus shifted entirely. He still had questions for Patricia. He hadn't seen Dorothy's will yet, but he wouldn't be surprised if Patricia was named in it, which would give her a motive as well. But the case against the Naughtiers was suddenly much stronger. He assured Patricia he would look into them. His next stop would be finding Brandon Nautier. 3 days later, on the afternoon of May 10th, Valalong was back in the same interrogation room. This time, he was facing 31-year-old Brandon Nautier. Brandon hadn't come alone. His lawyer was sitting right next to him. That alone told Valalong that Brandon was worried. Valalong had done his homework. Brandon had a criminal record that included assault, and everyone he spoke to in town described him as a hothead with a big mouth, someone who flew off the handle at the slightest provocation. Valalong expected a confrontational interview. But when he started asking about the lawsuit with Dorothy, Brandon was the picture of calm confusion. He claimed the whole thing was a huge misunderstanding. He said he and his wife had known Dorothy for years and considered her family. He insisted that Dorothy had wanted them to have the property, that she had practically given it to them as a gift. He claimed it was their idea to pay her for it at all. According to Brandon, everything had been fine until Patricia Newman got involved. He grew frustrated as he explained how Patricia had somehow poisoned Dorothy's mind, convincing her that they had taken advantage of her. Brandon claimed the opposite was true, that it was Patricia who was manipulating Dorothy. He then dropped a bombshell. He said that on multiple occasions, Dorothy had actually run away from her own house after fights with Patricia and had come to him and Bonnie for safety. He was painting Patricia as a controlling, abusive figure from whom Dorothy needed protection. Valalong was at a loss. Brandon was surprisingly convincing. He didn't seem smart enough to be a master manipulator to concoct such a detailed and plausible counter-narrative on the fly. It was hard to imagine this man pulling off a perfect murder and then coolly framing someone else. Of course, his ex-wife Bonnie was still a suspect. Maybe she was the brains of the operation. They were divorced now, but they had been in the lawsuit together. Maybe they had teamed up to solve their shared problem. Valalong wasn't ready to clear Brandon just yet, but he knew he had no evidence to hold him. He ended the interview and watched as Brandon and his lawyer left the room. Just a few days ago, he had no suspects. Now he had too many, and everyone seemed to have a motive tied to Dorothy's money or her land. About 5 months later, in October of 1985, Valalong and Sergeant Strata stood in the middle of Dorothy's pet cemetery, looking at the scene in disbelief. Nearly every single tombstone on the property had been smashed to pieces. It was an act of pure vandalism, and Valalong had no idea who was responsible. But in a strange way, it felt fitting. The cemetery was a wreck, and so was his investigation. In the months since May, he and other detectives had interviewed Patricia and Brandon multiple times. Each time, they just blamed the other. The situation with Dorothy's estate had devolved into a full-blown war. Dorothy's will had been read, and it revealed that Patricia Newman was set to inherit a significant portion of the estate, including the income from the pet cemetery business. But the Naughtiers were fighting it, claiming the property was legally theirs from the earlier sale, and that the unresolved lawsuit meant Patricia had no claim. To make matters even more complicated, Bonnie Nautier had actually moved into Dorothy's house and was living there, refusing to leave. That was why they were all here today. Patricia was trying to get into the house to retrieve some of Dorothy's personal effects, and Bonnie was refusing to let her in. The sheriff's department had sent uniformed officers to keep the peace, and Valalong and Strata had come along, hoping to finally get a chance to question Bonnie. But when they arrived, Bonnie was furious. She screamed at everyone to get off her property and refused to speak a word to the detectives. Eventually, the officers were able to escort Patricia inside to get what she needed, but Bonnie remained hostile and uncooperative. As Valalong and Strada walked back to their car past the shattered gravestones, a deep sense of frustration washed over them. They had multiple suspects, clear motives, and absolutely no way to tie any of them to the crime. Brandon Nadier had the strongest motive. Dorothy's death made his legal problems disappear. His ex-wife Bonnie was clearly determined to keep the property. But Patricia Newman also stood to gain financially, and her behavior during the investigation had been suspicious. Then there was Elkin Childress, the treasure-hunting handyman. Maybe he was the one who had smashed the tombstones looking for the buried money. Without any forensic evidence or witnesses, it felt like they were chasing ghosts. The case was going nowhere. The investigation continued for weeks, then months. Detectives re-interviewed everyone, chasing down every rumor. They even met with a psychic who claimed to know who the killer was. But nothing led to a breakthrough. As time stretched on, the case file for Dorothy Thompson grew thicker, but the answers remained out of reach. Eventually, the case was passed to new detectives, and then, finally, it was officially declared cold. 24 years went by. On a Thursday afternoon in late September of 2009, Detective John Duran of the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office was sitting at his desk, finishing up some paperwork. Another detective poked his head into his office. "That caller is on the phone for you," he said. Duran knew exactly who he meant. A few days prior, an anonymous man had called the tip line, claiming to have information about a cold case from 1985, the murder of the woman who owned the pet cemetery. Duran had known instantly he was talking about Dorothy Thompson. As a teenager, Duran had actually earned money cutting the grass at that cemetery. He and his friends knew all the stories about the eccentric old woman who lived there. The first time the tipster had called, he'd gotten nervous and hung up. This time, Duran was determined to keep him on the line. He picked up the phone. "Listen to me," he said calmly. "You are not in any trouble. I just need to know who you are and where I can meet you. Just tell me what you know." There was a long silence on the other end, and then the caller reluctantly agreed. Later that day, Duran and another detective sat in the living room of a small house in New Orleans. Across from them sat a nervous, older man. His eyes darted around the room, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected someone to attack him. Duran realized the man wasn't just nervous. He was genuinely terrified. Finally, the man took a deep breath. He said he knew who killed Dorothy Thompson, and he had known for over 2 decades. The guilt, he said, had been eating him alive. He told the detectives that he had started seeing Dorothy's ghost, covered in chains, begging him to come forward and tell the truth. Duran raised an eyebrow but said nothing. It didn't matter what prompted the man to call, it only mattered what he had to say. And then the man told them everything, based on that confession and the investigation that followed. Here is what police believe happened on the night of April 13th, 1985. Sometime after 9 o'clock that night, Brandon Nadier drove his truck up the long, winding driveway of the pet cemetery. He looked out at the rows of tombstones, at the dark woods, at the small house where Dorothy lived. He had been waiting for this property to be his, fighting for it in court. But now he had decided to stop waiting. He believed Dorothy didn't deserve to live, let alone own this land. He parked his truck, got out, and walked calmly to the back of the house. He knocked on the door. After a moment, Dorothy came to the door. She looked confused to see him there, but she knew him, so she opened it. The moment she did, Brandon lunged at her. She tried to scream, but he was too fast. His hands clamped around her throat, silencing her instantly. He strangled her there in her kitchen till she went limp. Then he found some bed sheets, wrapped her lifeless body in them, and dragged her outside to his truck. He drove from the cemetery to a deserted spot along the Mississippi River. He pulled her body from the truck, tied her hands and feet together, and for good measure pulled a plastic bag tightly over her head. Then he began wrapping her body in heavy industrial chains he had brought with him. When he was finished, he lifted her body, carried it to the edge of the riverbank, and threw it into the dark, swirling water. Then he got back in his truck and drove away, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. With Dorothy gone, the lawsuit was over. The property was his. It turned out that Brandon Nadier had not acted completely alone. He had asked another one of Dorothy's former handymen, a man named James Tregler, to ride along with him that night. Tregler waited in the truck while Brandon went inside and committed the murder. But Brandon, being the loudmouth he was, couldn't keep his secret. He had bragged about what he had done to his entire circle of friends. They all knew, and they all believed him, because they knew he was capable of such violence. But they were also terrified of him, so for 24 years they all kept silent. The anonymous caller was one of those friends, a man who could no longer live with the guilt. It took another 4 years of investigation after that initial tip, but police eventually located James Tregler. He confessed to being there that night and told them the entire story. With his testimony, they finally had enough to arrest Brandon Nadier for the murder of Dorothy Thompson. In 2012, Brandon surrendered to police. He pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to just 10 years in prison. His ex-wife, Bonnie, was determined to have not been involved. James Tregler, in exchange for his crucial testimony, was granted immunity from prosecution. Today, the pet cemetery is still there, but it is abandoned, the grounds overgrown with weeds and vines. The small tombstones are barely visible through the tall grass. But even now, people still visit the property. Treasure hunters, armed with metal detectors, still walk the haunted grounds, hoping to be the ones who finally find Dorothy Thompson's buried fortune. Let me know what you thought about today's case in the comments below. For more than 20 years, people believed Dorothy Thompson's killer had gotten away with the perfect crime. No witnesses, no evidence, just rumors, fear, and a lonely pet cemetery filled with secrets. And even now, long after the case was finally solved, locals still claim strange things happen on that property after dark. Some say it's only old ghost stories. Others aren't so sure. Somewhere beneath those overgrown graves, people still believe Dorothy's buried fortune is waiting to be found. Until next time.